Alright, here's some tips on how to sew buttons on using a regular sewing machine. All you really need is a machine that can do zigzag stitch, because to sew a button on with a machine, you're just zigzagging back and forth. There are a couple little tricks to this. One trick is that you need the button to stay in place, and sometimes that's easy if you're sewing it onto a thin material. Like here, I'm just on one layer. I can slide this button right under the presser foot and it stayed in place. But if you're doing a lot of layers, if your project is thicker, then sometimes what will happen is as you move the button under the presser foot, it moves and it's no longer placed correctly. So sometimes you can get away with it if you hold it really flat and lift the presser foot all the way up. But just to be certain that the button stays put, what I normally do is make a mark. I like to make like a plus sign like that with my Freon erasable heat pen, maybe even a little circle. And then I know that my button's where it's supposed to be, because that's really important on garments. And then I like to use a little glue stick to hold it in place. And I've never had any problems with glue stick. The guy tech who maintains my machine says my machines look great and there's no problem with using glue stick. David Page Coffin, the late David Page Coffin, used glue stick in his videos and quite a bit, and so I've had no problem with it. However, I did recently use a machine, a newer Singer that was a rather inexpensive model, and it would skip stitches when I tried to sew a button on that had a little dab of glue stick there. So I don't know, I think maybe those machines are so lacking power that they can't really go through anything more than 2 layers of quilting cotton, and just the extra resistance of the glue made it skip because the motors are just so weak on those things. So you might test it first to make sure your machine doesn't have trouble going through glue stick if you haven't used it before. If it does, you could, I don't know, maybe Scotch tape? I guess you just have to hold it in place very carefully if that won't work. The other thing you really need the machine to have in order to do this is a solid presser foot, which most machines have, but I was working on another inexpensive newer Singer that had a really wobbly plastic presser foot, and every time I tried to put the presser foot down on the button, it wouldn't hold it in place because it would just wobble out. So I think that's pretty unusual, but you do need a zigzag foot that will hold the button in place, okay? And a zigzag machine and some way to make sure the button stays where you want it. Once that's done, all you need to do is set your machine up for zigzag and then set the length to 0, push it all the way down. I suppose you could even drop the feed dogs for that matter, but I usually just push the length down to nothing so that the feed dogs aren't feeding at all, because you're just going to go zigzag. All you're going to do is zigzag back and forth through the holes. Now here's the other important thing, of course, is to set the width correctly, because if your width is incorrect and your needle hits the button, it's going to break the button. So you might not even want to do this on them with something like, heirloom buttons if you only have one or one replacement. You might prefer to hand stitch it in that case, which I'll also will show the technique for, the proper technique, in the next part of this video. So anyway, you set that needle, you hand wheel that needle down into the first hole, and I see that my needle's on the left, so I'm putting in the left hole, and I'm going to hand wheel it to the right. And I'm going to look at that, see where it wants to go. It's just a little wide, it's not bad. So I'm going to move the length down, the width of that zigzag a little narrower. And now I'm looking underneath, and it still wants to slide out even with this great pressure foot. So you do have to kind of hold this in place just a little. It might be risky to have your fingers right there, but you kind of want to hold it in place. So this might be a good place. Oh, look at this. This is a great place for the stiletto. Okay, so now I've got this. I've hand wheeled this several times, so I know it's going in the correct hole. So now I can just carefully do this until I've got it where I want. And then I would do the other 2 holes and I'd be set. Now, I don't know how many other machines come with a special foot and setting for sewing on buttons, but The Bernina does, and I love this 330. They don't even make them anymore. But anyway, the disadvantage, this works fine. It's a very utilitarian, quick way to sew a bunch of buttons on. The drawback is there's no shank. The button is flush against the fabric, which makes it a little trickier to button. So if you're doing something, if you really care about that, you're doing maybe a single button on a jacket or a pair of jeans or something, you might want a little more of a shank underneath, a thread shank underneath there, a little bit, something to lift that button up off the fabric a little. You'll notice if you look at a commercial shirt, the buttons aren't totally plastered flat like that, okay? So what you could do in that, if you want that, if that's your goal and that's important to you, then you'd probably want to then you'll need to hand sew your button on, unless you can get a foot like this, if your machine comes with a foot like this specifically made for sewing buttons on. So the way this thing works, I'm going to be careful not to advance my needle because it would hit that right now, but there's a stitch just for sewing on buttons on my machine. It's number 11, so I'm going to hit number 11, and then the machine will automatically adjust for sewing on a button, and it'll go for the correct width. Surprisingly, most buttons have the holes the same distance apart. I keep reaching for the knee bar, and I had to take the knee bar off because this machine isn't normally in this cabinet. No, the knee bar doesn't fit. Anyway, most button holes are a specific standard distance apart, and this machine will default when I'm in that button setting to that distance. I didn't hold the threads, and that might make it unhappy. No, it's still fine. So I'm still going to check nonetheless. I'm going to make sure that the distance is correct so that I don't sink that needle into the plastic. And now I'm confident. I hand wheeled a few times. I see it's good. So I'm just going to run the program. So slow and carefully and watching it, holding if I need to. So this foot automatically will sew on exactly the number of stitches that is standard and good. And then you slide it forward and do the other one. And that little bar, what that's doing is holding the thread up a little. It's creating a shank in there so that this button won't be as tight in. Starting to wonder when it was going to stop. And then you just slide it off, and you can see on this one when you pull it up, there's a shank on there. There's like some extra thread. It's loose. You probably can't see that. I'm doing a bad job here. It's looser here. It's hard to see that, but see there's extra thread because that little bar there held it up. So that's really ideal if you can do that. But these buttons are perfectly serviceable, sewn on like that. It's a quick way if you say you're doing a mending and you're missing a button and you end up having to replace all the buttons on a shirt and got to do like 8 buttons or something. I mean, I do that and find it very serviceable.